Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at TRN's VX Pro. So the VX Pro is an update to last year's VX, which was a 1DD 7BA. The VX Pro adds another BA, so it is a 1DD 8BA, and I think it says it on one of these, not that one, but perhaps this one. So in case you forget, they conveniently labeled the side of it, 1DD 1BA TRN audio. So not quite the same shell as the VX. It's similar. It's sort of missing that shell scallop pattern, but it is, again, it's just a very nice metal. It's got this satiny finish to it. Quite nice. Stock cable. I don't know. This is probably the same cable they've used a bunch of times. It's probably time to switch that one up on your $88 1DD 8BAs, but whatever. So TRN earphone case, always quite nice. These are nice metal cases. This one is empty because I took everything out of it, but so kind of a nice package for $88. Kind of a step up from where they were with their V90 series and the V90S, which is a kind of more Spartan package, so not too bad. So I do want to thank Hi-Fi Go for shipping this one out to me. If you look on, I actually got this one from their Amazon store because that's always more convenient for me. So if you look today, it is $88 on the Hi-Fi Go store on Amazon. So again, thank you for sending that one out. So let's talk a little bit of history about what really happened last year and where we are and what these all mean. So last year, TRN VX, which is not the follow-on to the V90, but it came out, I think it was the next flagship after the V90, so people sort of assumed it was going to be another V90, but it was actually different. And a lot of people didn't review it. The people who reviewed it said it was way sharp, spicy treble, kind of a screeching set. And yeah, it was definitely on the edge. And I think what it really came down to was TRN was not necessarily pitching this towards a Western ear. It's a more global or Eastern ear. Maybe that's where they had actually intended the market to be. So whatever the case is, it started the trend of TRN and these spicy treble sets, which don't necessarily sit well with Western ears. So if we look at the TRN VX from last year, it had kind of a lower bass, and I think I put a piece of tape on the VX, and it actually brings this up a little bit. If you cover the vent, you actually get a little more bass response out of it. And then it had this kind of wicked rise, and then it's just a strong treble set and not necessarily easy on the ears, fatiguing. To most Western music, it doesn't sound natural because it's emphasizing some parts of tracks that don't necessarily need to be emphasized in popular music. So that was the VX. So not such a popular set here, but apparently it was popular in other parts of the world. So a year later, when we look at the green line, which is this VX Pro in stock form, so they did bring the bass up a little bit, which is sort of what I did with the VX, and that helps to give it a little more balance, so it's not nearly as bright as the original VX was. So this one does have a little more low end, which is needed. And it has, I don't know if that actually changed a whole lot. That rise at 2K is kind of serious, and it really, combined with the whole upper range, again, it is very much the DNA of the normal VX. It is not necessarily pitched towards Western ears. It's definitely pitched towards a style of music that is very much concentrated in this area and sounds good with that. But for popular music here, it just sounds bright. And I don't know if there's any other word for it other than it's a bright and fatiguing set depending on your tolerance for treble. So one thing you can do, and if we go back to what I did with the VX, you put some tape over it, it makes it a little less sharp. So with the VX Pro, kind of went with the Tanya mod. So Tanya if you remember, I don't remember, on the Tanya comes with 10 sets of filters for replacing it on Tanya. And these filters tend to work right in this area right here in this 2K, this lower treble area. So you can see the blue line is with the Tanya filters, and it brings it down quite a bit. So this part is much easier on your ears, less bright, but you still have quite a strong upper range, but it's just not screaming in your ear like it does in stock form. So I just laid them right on top, and you get almost, I think from the right angle, you can kind of see that the old mesh is actually still there through the filter, but just lay it on top. And this happens to be one of these popular things that people have been doing lately, because the Tanya filters have this property of lowering these lower treble ranges and making things less sharp, less shouty. So yeah, so that is how I listen to Tanya without doing something, EQ, filters. It is kind of way too much for me anyway. It just gets way too fatiguing too quickly. So I had actually started out with EQ, and it's actually easier just to stick a Tanya filter on it than it is to deal with EQ filters and trying to keep the same character. And you can kind of see even the filter, maybe this is a little bit too much, but at least this gets you to the point where you can listen to it for a length of time and it's not super fatiguing and yelling in your ear. So let's kind of spin through this real quickly because I don't have a ton to add to what I already said. I mean, what it really comes down to is this one is pitched towards very specific group who like this type of sound, whether that's regional or cultural. I have no idea, but it's definitely pitched towards people who have, a fondness for very high, lower treble, and in general, just a lot of treble. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily a treble head. I think it's a very unique. The frequencies that they pick are super fatiguing for me, so I'm fine. Even if you go back to like a Loca high, Loca hey sets that have a lot of treble, that's an extension. Those are generally pretty good as long as they're not peaky at certain frequencies. And the VX Pro is just one of those that it just hits a couple frequencies that are super fatiguing for me. So we will spin through this, but I don't know what to say. I don't know who the person is who can, know that this isn't going to be super fatiguing for them, or this is something they're looking for, but whatever the case. So, as I said, VX Pro is the same DNA as the VX. The chart, kind of, you can kind of see what they did here. They just brought up the bass. The treble doesn't necessarily change a whole lot, but it has the same DNA, the same character. I think the same characteristics of the VX. There isn't that much difference other than they added an 8BA, which, I think does something, but it's kind of hard to hear that something when it's super fatiguing. So, like I said, your treble preference and tolerance at your volume is sort of the main problem with this set. It's very hard to know whether you're going to find this too fatiguing or just right without trying it. I mean, I don't know what the metric is, but all I will say is that I won't necessarily listen to this without a filter or an EQ or something to bring those frequencies down to reasonable levels. So EQ or Tanya filters to lower the intensity and fatigue. And that's really what it comes down to. There's this intensity to this upper range that hits you kind of like right in your brain, right in your eardrum. So it's not like a general higher level of treble, which is fine. It's this intensity to it. It's almost that 4 to 5K range. When you bump that and you get this very piercing intensity to those frequencies, that's what it sounds like to me. But with filters, you kind of shift that balance a little bit lower, especially on the vocals where they sound a little bit more natural and lower, and it's not overwhelmingly bright. So what does it sound like? It's a bright V shape. There's enough bass, and like I said, they bumped it up a little bit. Without filters, it definitely feels a bit cold, detailed, sharp, almost analytical. There's not a ton of warmth to it. There isn't a whole lot of bleed to it. The dynamic driver is actually quite nice, and it definitely stays way controlled. But there's just this aggressive sharpness to it without a filter that dominates the sound signature. So the bass, I will say it's enough, and it's actually really good quality. It was the dynamic driver and the bass is actually my favorite part of the set, and especially coming from the VX, which you had to bump it to get it to the point where it was you could even listen to it. It was just way too low, and so on the VX Pro when they bumped it up, it's really nice. It's definitely a nice quality dynamic driver. It's got this nice definition to it. It's kind of tight and fast. Yeah, it was definitely not the star of the set, but definitely my favorite part of the set. It's kind of too bad that it's kind of pushed down beneath a whole bunch of brightness, but when you hear it, and especially on tracks that just concentrate on the lower end, it's actually quite nice. And I don't think it's all that far from people who have complimented TRN dynamic drivers in the past. I think they tend to do a more quality finish than what KZ does, which is more of a fun, a little more boomy, a little less definition, and TRN tended to do a little more tighter, a little bit faster, and I think this one is right in line with that tradition. So when you put filters on it, so with no filters, yeah, it just leans bright, and it's just not natural or full. It just kind of sounds thin and bright, but super detailed and sharp. The brightness really hides the texture. I mean, all you hear is the upper range of the voice. It's really hard to pick out the texture unless you're really used to hearing something like that. And lower female, lower male sound okay when you actually go down low enough. So, yeah. And it sounds a bit compressed, and the dynamics are limited because you're only hearing the upper end. And yeah. So, with filters, more natural, vocals have better balance. There's kind of an upper and a lower to the vocals and the harmonics, a bit more weight to it, more of a mid focus than a lower treble. So, the whole sound shifts a little bit. So kind of stock, it feels like everything happens here. There's just this insane attention and focus on the lower treble, and then if you just shift it down with the filters, that's kind of what it sounds like. It just shifts it enough, and it shifts this whole range down a little bit, so it's not so emphasized. And then what kind of shines through are the mids, and they actually sound quite good when you put some filters on it. Definitely more natural, more weight and more focus, and you could actually enjoy the detail without all the fatigue of doing it without the filters. And you also notice that it's a bit more recessed or offset. And when you put the filters on it, the stage kind of becomes apparent of what's going on, and the vocals are offset a little bit in the stage. And it's kind of hard to hear that with a whole lot of treble, but you put some filters on it, then the whole thing kind of makes a little more sense. So the treble emphasis on the lower, which is super intense and hard to hear beyond it, it really dominates. And just like the VX, you've got to pick music that either for a Western ear doesn't hit those parts as hard, or you got to use some EQ or filter or something. But otherwise, it's very hard to focus on smaller details beyond the lower treble, because the lower treble is just going to be crushing and hiding everything else beyond it. So on less intense tracks, sounds pretty good. It still sounds a little like BA timbre. It's a little thin, not so metallic. It actually sounds kind of natural, just a little bit thin, and that's, again, it's just way up there for my ears. So with filters, you end up with this more relaxed presentation. It's a lot less fatiguing, but it still has a strong upper range. The filters doesn't really go beyond, or it doesn't really do too much reduction into the upper treble. So all that is still there, and it'll still kind of catch you with some intense parts, but it definitely still sounds, you still have that upper range and the extension. There's just a little less air to it. And so while the graph doesn't really show it, that's what it kind of comes off to me, is that there's just a little less intensity in air, especially in those upper treble regions. That I'm not sure if it's just my coupler, but I would swear that it dropped more in the upper range than it does on the graph. So I'll have to figure that out someday. So the stage and the imaging. So again, without filters or EQ, a whole lot of treble tends to flatten the stage, and everything becomes kind of right in your face. Lots of upper range sounds sound very close to in your face, and it sounds wide, but there's no depth to it with all that high frequency. So plenty of width, and like I said, the imaging is actually pretty good, and it rarely sounds cluttered or muddy, and all that is true. But with filters, when you bring down that upper range just a little bit, the whole thing opens up a little bit more. And it's just kind of a weird effect when you get used to it. If you don't have enough treble, the stage sounds closed in. But if you have too much, it feels like it's flat and really in your face. So it's very much a delicate balance. And when you get it right, and when you hear the vocals out in the stage and it's nice and wide, I do think it's actually a pretty good above average stage, especially at this price. And I would say it sounds pretty good at that price. There's some points, especially when there's not a ton of treble, where you're like, wow, this sounds very, very good for a hybrid, even at $88. And it's very much what people thought about the V90. It's almost a upgraded V90 with all that detail and resolution and stage. All those things are in dynamic driver. All those things work for it well, but until you hear a bright part, and then it kind of all fades away, and you're like, ugh, why can't they just make a V90 with 8+1 that's tuned more like the V90? So that's it. I was thinking that was going to be shorter, but maybe not. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.